Now I'll talk about trade disciplines. And when we talk about trade, I use this word disciplines. I mean, this is a term of art that we use in the trade literature. It has a specific meaning in the sense that there's some consequences that flow from being subject to disciplines. So the answer is that in international government organizations, you have disciplines associated with the WTO. You have disciplines associated with the IMF and the World Bank. That is the Bretton Woods triad. You have disciplines associated with them. You don't play ball with IMF. They will not give you that last tranche. They will let your currency go to hell. If you don't play ball with the WTO, they will allow a particular country to raise countervailing duties. You saw the United States backing off on steel. Now the newest thing is, of course, they lost the online gambling case that was launched against them by Antigua and Barbuda. And this little country of less than 100,000 people will start putting countervailing duties on the United States one of these days, because that's what discipline means. So the kinds of places that I've associated with most of my career, the ITU, the UNDP, I have not had the fortune of getting any tear gas in these places because they do not have disciplines, they do not have power. They are toothless dog shops that nobody takes much notice of. The important thing about the Canada-US Free Trade Agreement that attracted my attention was that it was the very first time that disciplines had been brought in to trade in services. Earlier there were disciplines associated with trade in goods, but this was the first time that services were brought into a regime of disciplines. One could argue that services were covered by the US-Israel Free Trade Agreement. That was prior to the Canada Agreement by a few years, but that simply said best efforts will be made to liberalize trade in services, which meant it was like a UNESCO declaration, nothing more than that. It was not subject to disciplines. So when you talk about goods, as a poster that I read today about the WTO said, those days it was very simple, because when you talk about goods, you simply are trying to bring down the tariffs. If the tariffs are at 25%, you bring it down to 20, you bring it down to 15, you bring it down to 0. But that's what you do in liberalizing goods trade. But once you bring it down to somewhere between 0 and 10, the non-tariff barriers become interesting. That is, the other ways in which you prevent the movement of goods. So as you go into the NTBs or non-tariff barriers area, you begin to see people perceiving all kinds of intrusions into their lives, into the way they govern themselves. When you get into services, there are no tariffs. Nobody was charging tariffs on services, because services are difficult to catch hold of or even to count, so you can't charge tariffs on them. So the only thing that exists in services is domestic regulation. The only way you liberalize services trade is by changing domestic regulation. So by definition, bringing services under trade disciplines is going to cause concerns about national sovereignty, because it's got to mean reaching inside somebody's country, inside nation state, and says, oh, you can't do it that way, you have to do it this way, or you have to do it the way we are doing it, or we have to have the same way in two countries. Now, one of my favorite examples was when I was teaching at Ohio State, one of my colleagues in ag economics telling me with a straight face that the absence of US type advertising in Europe for food products was a barrier to trade in agricultural goods, because you see, you didn't allow films to be interrupted in Europe. So the idea was that if you didn't, Desica had to be interrupted by nacho ads for there to be free trade. So that's sort of like an extreme example, right? So that's on the good side, but definitely there are all these things that happen. Almost the game starts with controversy on the services side. So the Americans at this time were of the opinion that they were going to have some kind of natural advantage on services. I don't think they really calculated on Bangalore and accent neutralization at that point, that other people could have natural advantages in service supply. But they were of the opinion that the way the economy was going, in fact, the opinion was that the future economy was a services economy. And thanks to one of the scholarships here, the Steele Scholarship, I believe, Ada and Isabel Steele, one of those, which actually compelled me to travel. I wouldn't have got some of that money if I didn't go. So I went, and I was privileged to talk to people who are really at the cutting edge of this kind of thinking inside the US government, people like Gesa Feketakuti, who is still active somewhere, not in the government, but somewhere else, who were thinking of this as the future economy and of trying to open it up. The British were thinking about it. They were collecting information about what is called trade in invisibles. But again, this was at a very early stage in the debate. So the idea was that since the game was almost over on goods, and since the terms of trade were going to be shifting against the United States in particular, we got to open up services. That was the thinking that was going on at that time. Of course, there were many people who said, this is quite too intrusive, quite controversial, etc. And also they had all these issues of how to define this, how to handle trade. You had these arguments like, how could you trade haircuts, right? I mean, people used to actually have serious arguments about trading haircuts. So I will actually walk you through the haircut example just for fun under current technological circumstances and see how it can be done. So basically the issue was settled by talking about these 4 modes, and you cannot do any work in services trade today, any of the legal work, without knowing these modes, mode 1, mode 2, mode 3, mode 4. Mode 1 is very much like goods trade, which means the seller is in country A, in this case, let's say that's the United States, the buyer is in country B. So you need telecommunications in order to do this, to do services trade. While in the case of goods, you have this tangible thing that would come from there to here. It's very much like goods trade. Mode 2 is where the buyer travels to country A. So you'd have to go to the place. So the classic example of this, of course, is tourism, where tourism services are produced in Mexico. Plane loads of Canadians go to Mexico in order to consume them, and they come back. Mode 3 is where the seller establishes a commercial presence in country B. That is, an American bank or business establishment or whatever, that service supplier will come and set up a firm here, a presence here. Now, there's no reason why there should be a single American associated with that. It could be that they employ only Canadians, and it would still come under mode 3. And it's basically a foreign investment issue at that point. Mode 4 is when that's artificial persons. So a lot of people who, when I talk about these things, say, what? Are they unnatural persons? I said, yes, people who do trade law. But natural persons coming in to work in that commercial establishment would be a combined mode 3 and mode 4 trade. So let's now see how the haircutting works. Haircutting, as you can understand, is a little tough on mode 1, but I will tell you how it can be done with good Canadian technology. Let's start with easy ones. Mode 2, you get in a bus or you get in a car and you go to Bellingham and get a haircut on the other side of the border. That's mode 2 trade in haircuts. Pure mode 3, where whatever the US haircutting chain would come and set up an establishment here. Pure form employs only Canadians. Mode 3, mode 4 combined form employs Canadians. So all kinds of sort of foreign investment type issues would come in. Are you given additional requirements for establishing this? Are you allowed to repatriate your profits, et cetera, et cetera? pure mode 4, without mode 3, would be itinerant haircutters would come across and cut people's hair and go back, right, without commercial establishment. Now, until December, I thought that was it, but I happened to meet a professor from the University of Hamilton by the name of Dr. Mehran Anwari, who is actually using telecommunications to operate on people. I'm not talking about observing, advising, instructing. He's actually cutting flesh in northern Ontario while sitting in Hamilton, right? Telemedicine in the pure form, right? Now, if you can imagine that this doctor is actually cutting up people in faraway places, I mean, he does have a doctor standing nearby, near the patient. But he is doing that. I mean, he's wearing gloves and he's offered to let me, you can check the guy out on the web. It's quite intriguing. He's offered to give me a full demonstration. He even offered to come to Sri Lanka and do something. Now, if you can imagine that, now I can imagine mode 1 hair cutting for the first time in my life, right? So all these years we said you can't do mode 1 hair cutting, and now with Canadian technology you can, right? So this is what services trade is. What is unusual about this? I mean, this has gone on for years and years. I mean, I had to give a talk to the architects in Sri Lanka about, they were getting all excited. So I said, well, I'll come and talk to you. I won't do anything to you without explaining to you what the hell is going on. So I went and I said, I mean, look at all the world's great buildings. All these have been, more or less, have been built by foreign architects. What's new about this? People have been moving across borders and building, supplying architectural services all over the world. What are you guys getting excited about, right? So the issue is, I mean, services trade across borders has been going on for a long time. Most probably the people in this room have been engaging in services trade across borders longer than you think. I mean, I know Pat and Roger have been supplying English, whatever, educational services in China, and we've all done this. I mean, what am I doing now? I'm selling services here. Well, what I'm getting paid is a different question, but I'm right. The issue really is that for these things you need communication, as you can see. First one, absolutely you need communication. So it's without telecommunications, this whole mode 1 thing was not possible. Now with mode 1, for the architects, the whole idea of moving blueprints back and forth, doing the blueprints in India and having the house built in the United States, etc., is feasible now. It wasn't very feasible those days, right? Mode 3 is pretty much, I mean, it really has nothing to do with telecom per se. It's really about foreign investment, but any kind of foreign investment where you want to control that investment, the classic principal agent problem, you need communication to engage in that. And for mode 2, you could say that what you really need is transportation, because you need to ship these people over to the other side, the consumers. But again, you need telecommunications in order to make that possible. And mode 4, when the natural persons come across the border, they need to come in some transportation medium, and you also need telecommunications to make that possible. So almost all the agreements, irrespective of whether telecommunications is covered or not. So for example, for those who are into these gory details, Protocol 4, which covers telecommunication services of the GATS, the General Agreement in Trade in Services, irrespective of that, there are telecommunication obligations that apply to all parties to the GATS. Irrespective of whether telecommunications is in it, the telecommunication services that are necessary for doing other things have to be given on a non-discriminatory basis. So the problem, however, with trade in services is this whole idea of, it's a very difficult, slippery thing to control. I mean, just imagine trying to sort of put a tax on those tourists landing in the charters, coming back from Mexico, say, well, how much fund did you have? And give me 10% of that for the government, right? And they say, oh, we had a miserable time, you should give us money, or something to that effect. So it's very difficult to control this. While goods, if you go back to the history of economics started as political arithmetic, because they were collecting all these numbers at the ports of various things where the kings were collecting customs. And there were these guys who said, got all this data, what do we do with it? And that was sort of one of the ways in which economics developed. So this thing is very difficult to control because it just seeps all over the place. You can't quite control it. Because even without the internet, services used to go in various ways. As I was telling Bob, every time I cross the Canadian border, they try to put various barriers to services trade on me, asking me what I'm going to do in Canada and so on and so forth. They know that I look like a seller of services. Except when I drive with my kids, then they don't ask me questions. When I come by myself, they ask me a lot of questions. And of course, there are many barriers to trade in services, like the restriction on hiring non-Canadians in Canadian universities, which I think has done great harm to Canadian universities. See, I want controversy. What it really does is that if you're trying to do any form of trade liberalization, any form of getting it into some disciplinary forms, you have to reach in to the universities, to all these organizations, and say, you can't do this, you can't do that. You're subject to disciplines. And that really sends shivers up the spines of people who like the nation state. This creature of the Treaty of Westphalia, it was not like it existed forever and ever. It's not that Karl Marx was a fan of it. It's just that some bunch of kings and prime ministers in Europe got together and came up with this model of a nation state. And lots of people have got emotionally invested in it. And this investment is threatened by the fact that we could very well be moving into these areas.